Okay, so I am not going to be here today and tomorrow for you guys in regular and honors U.S. history. For my B-Day classes for 2B and 3B, I won't see you until Tuesday, right? And Tuesday you have a test over Unit 7. The Socrative is open 844440. So be sure that you take the time to look at the Socrative questions. First period, you have a couple of new students. Please make sure that they know how to find the Socrative and how to access it, please, and thank you. The next part of this, I'm going to quickly go through the aspects of the end of the war, and I'm going to, for you guys in first and fifth period, this will kind of wrap up the lecture portion, and then for those of you in 2B and 3B, this will take over part of the class, and the second part of the class, you'll have time to work on your illustrated timeline and the list of terms and that kind of thing. So I want to talk about it, and I'm not going to show the video clips with the Holocaust, mostly because YouTube will probably block it, and I don't want to have to deal with that. But this concentration camps, we obviously, because we're U.S. history, we don't really focus as much on this idea of what the Holocaust was about, what the causes were. We just barely kind of touch on it. What I want you to grasp is that American soldiers, as they start moving, as you have the success of the invasion of France and as they start moving into Germany, you have American soldiers discovering what was happening. And so this is kind of a list from Wikipedia that shows you, you know, how many different camps there were. You've got concentration camps, you've got labor camps, you've got extermination camps. And again, it's easy to just think, oh, it was only 6 million Jews. In reality, it was closer to like 10 or 11 million people in total. It included Poles, Gypsies, political enemies, dissidents, anybody that didn't fit the standard of the Aryan kind of perfection, people that challenged the Nazi authority, all those kinds of things. These people were sent to these camps, and the conditions were pretty horrific. One of the things you can see, this kind of gives you an idea for kind of the location of some of the camps. And so as the Americans come in, they liberate over here by Nordhausen in this particular area. The Soviets sweep in this way. The Soviets are responsible for liberating many of the camps in Poland. Part of what happens is the Germans, as they are losing the war, they forcibly evacuate people from Poland and move them into Germany. And those that basically forced death marches, that kind of thing. And so you have them discovering exactly what was meant by the final solution. And there's a lot more to the story about the Holocaust. And again, I'm just really touching on the fact that the Americans discover what was happening. And really the Americans will then focus on, prosecuting the Germans for the atrocities that they committed. We will also prosecute the Japanese for some of their atrocities. So Americans play a big role in that. This is a picture of a boxcar that they used to transport human beings and that kind of thing. And make no mistake, this results in a lot of death and destruction and very horrible conditions. There's many movies out there that kind of dictate that. I've got several links, so if you're really curious, you can pull up my PowerPoint and you can follow these links and see some of these videos. These are kind of school appropriate, although they do show graphic starvation. And kind of gives you a sense of what the Holocaust was like. And so I'm just, like I said, I'm really barely touching on it. Hopefully you got some of this in world history. And if not, then I encourage you to look at some of those video clips and kind of familiarize yourself with that. But for now, for our purposes for American history, just knowing that the Americans do hold the Nazis to account for what they do, I think is sufficient for you to get through, certainly through the STAR test. But like I said, there's way more to the story than just that. So let's jump into the war ending. We're going to explain the tactics the Allies used to invade Germany and defeat Japan, and look at the reasons why the Allies created the United Nations. And again, and I don't know, I'm going to try this and see if it will let me go ahead and play the video. Well, no, I think what we'll do, I'll have the sub kind of pull up the video or pull up the PowerPoint, and then the sub can follow the links for the different kind of videos, and that way we don't have to worry about putting it on this particular part. Allies, as they begin to discover these atrocities, they hold the war crimes. A lot of what will happen after they first have that initial invasion of Normandy is you have what we call hedgerow fighting. These are, in the next picture kind of shows you, hedgerows are these kind of like mounds of dirt with trees. This is what they would often use to kind of separate fields off, right? So for a lot of these, for the American soldiers, it is a process of taking it one field at a time. And so it makes it the process of getting control of northern France a very challenging one. You certainly have the role of the French resistance helping, and that kind of thing. By August of 44, Paris is liberated, and you can see the link here. And again, the French resistance is a big part of it. Now, understand that the liberation of France, there's a lot of kind of hatred and frustration. One of these clips will show you them shaving off women's heads. Women that had, you know, what they called collaborated, anybody who had worked with the Nazis, and understand that if in occupied France, right, you may have collaborated because you were trying to take care of your family. You may have collaborated because you didn't really have a choice. You didn't want to be sent to a camp. There could be lots of reasons why you were actually, you know, helping the Nazis. There's a pretty strong reaction against by the French against people that had done that. And so one of the things that the Americans kind of get shocked by is the level of kind of anger that the French have towards people that had worked with the Nazis. So just kind of understand that while Paris is liberated and France begins to be liberated, it's not all unicorns and rainbows. There's some challenges that come from this. FDR will win a unprecedented fourth term in November of 1944. Mostly because the war is over and nobody wants to have a change in leadership at that point. Now, this is the reason why we have the 22nd Amendment, 22nd, 2 terms, that prevents, that basically sets the constitutional limit that presidents can only serve 2 terms. And that was a direct result of FDR and him winning that election in November 1944. So you can kind of see the videos and give you an idea. You know, like I said, this whole idea of the hedgerow fighting, that was particularly challenging. They never knew when they crossed over a hedgerow if there was going to be a machine gun, if there were going to be a group of Nazis hanging out over there. It was pretty deadly, and if you've watched the movie Saving Private Ryan, you certainly see kind of the impact of that as well. The next one, Battle of the Bulge, and there's a couple video links here that the sub should be able to pull up and kind of show you. And what you see is that the Nazis will come in, and this kind of shows you. So here's Belgium, right? So France is over here. There's Germany. And so they basically, they push in this area in the southern part of Belgium and the northern part of France, and they try to basically break through the Allied lines and get the Allies surrounded. And it almost works. It gets very, very close to that. And so what will happen is that the Germans will try to cut the supply lines, will manage to succeed in defeating them. But it's incredibly, like this period of December 44, January of 45 is a very difficult winter, brutally cold, lots of like terrible weather. And what you're going to see is that Bastogne is kind of this like hub for the railroad, right? And this is where Bastogne is, and it gets surrounded. And so the Allies, the Americans, hold Bastogne even as they're surrounded by Nazis. And what will happen is that George Patton will bring his tanks and he'll break through. And when he does that, he starts pushing the Germans back. Now, a lot of what causes Germany to lose in the Battle of the Bulge is going to be a lack of fuel. And so it's a very difficult kind of month right there. So you'll want to recognize the Battle of the Bulge as being one of the kind of the last attempt by the Nazis to kind of regain a foothold. Really a strong stand by the Americans to prevent that from happening. George Patton and his tanks coming in and rescuing the town. And really being, I wouldn't say it's the last battle of the war, but it's kind of the last kind of like offensive, defensive maneuver that we see, even though you've got battles. Understand that Germany surrenders by April. So really what's happening after the Battle of the Bulge, and these are some pictures of how cold it was. What's happening after the Battle of the Bulge is going to be kind of this process of chasing the Nazis down. And they're being squished between the Russians on the eastern side and the Americans on the western side, and kind of this race to see who can get to Berlin. And you start to see indications of some of the emerging tensions with the emerging tensions with the United States and the Soviet Union. And so that's going to be kind of a problem. This is going to be one of the reasons why there's such a competition to get to Berlin, and that kind of thing. So you have, by April 21st, 1945, the Soviets are in Berlin. They haven't completely controlled Berlin. Like they're still, the Nazis still hold part of it. Hitler will commit suicide on April 30th. I've got a video here that kind of talks about Hitler's, the likelihood that he had Parkinson's disease. His body gets burned, and so we don't have any evidence of his body, and he wanted it that way because he was afraid of what the Soviets were going to do to his body, and he probably should have been. The Soviets were pretty awful to the Germans as they come through, and so you definitely have that happening there. Eisenhower has an unconditional surrender that happens May 7th, 1945. That is called Victory in Europe, VE Day. Germans did not want to surrender to the Soviets. They wanted to surrender to the Americans. They thought the Americans might be a little more generous. We weren't. But the Soviets were, they were being pretty vicious, killing people, holding people. There wasn't any effort to like hold a trial to see who was really to blame. And so you have that happening. You have them chasing down a number of different German officials. Goring would be one. Goebbels commits suicide. It's Goring, and Himmler disappears, and there's another guy that and so you have kind of this process of trying to find the Nazi leadership and that kind of thing. So Victory in Europe Day, these are pictures kind of proclaiming VE Day. Huge deal. But remember that for the United States, this is not over, right? We're still fighting a two-front war. So we're still fighting in Japan. Now, before the war is actually over, on April 12th, FDR will die. Vice President Harry Truman becomes the president. And so he is the one that kind of brings the war to an end, both in Europe and in the Pacific. Now, obviously, what's happening in Europe is kind of on autopilot a little bit. You don't necessarily have, I don't know that Truman makes any specific decisions in April to help bring about the end of the war. But what does happen, and this is why I was saying that in that period in April, as you have the U.S. and as you have the Soviets rushing into Germany, trying to see who can get there first and who can, part of that backstory is that FDR died, and FDR had worked really well with Stalin, and Truman comes in and he doesn't work well with Stalin. Stalin doesn't trust him, and so you've got this really tense relationship between Truman and Stalin, and so this kind of adds to that. This is really kind of the beginning of what we'll see as the Cold War. And so what you'll find out is that Truman learns about the atomic bomb and the Manhattan Project. He starts hearing the figures about, kind of the invasion of mainland Japan. And so you start seeing a lot of things like that taking place. So really, the Truman's big contribution is going to be kind of the Potsdam Conference, which we'll talk about here in a minute, and then the conclusion of the Pacific Campaign, particularly dropping the atomic bomb. So for the most part, it's just the U.S. and Japan. One of the problems that Truman has with Stalin is that the Soviets are very slow. You have May, the Germans have surrendered. And, of course, if you remember back to what was at the Tehran Conference, the the Soviet Union had promised to step in and help the U.S. fight Japan, because remember, you know, Soviet Union's pretty close to Japan, and they're not doing that. They're not helping us, and so we're starting to try to fight, trying to, you know, bring this thing to an end, and the Japanese are just not giving up. The military refuses to surrender because, of course, you know, for the Japanese, surrender is not an option. And really, they have armed their civilian population in preparation for a mainland invasion. You know, it's going to be difficult, right? One of the main battles that you need to know is that they want to, in preparation for the invasion of Japan, they need to increase their bombing campaigns. They need to drop heavy bombs. So they need the B-29 bombers, and so they need to get a closer Air Force base. Now, the island of Iwo Jima, that's very close to Japan, is already had an air base on it, and so they're trying to capture Iwo Jima. And I've got a video clip here. It's very rocky. It's kind of there's a volcano there, Mount Suribachi. And so the Japanese will dig extensive cave networks in there. And so Iwo Jima is really one of these awful battles. I mean, if you think about that clip we watched from D-Day, Iwo Jima is different because they basically kind of let the Americans start to get on the beachhead a little bit. And then they start this process of kind of sneak attacks and booby traps. And they have all these bunkers and all these caves. And so these Japanese soldiers are hidden everywhere. So it's very difficult to fight, you know, them, and it takes them a while. You see, it takes a month to get the island really under control. You've got 6,800 Marines that died on Iwo Jima. I mean, that's, you know, you're talking like half of what died on D-Day, right? And a lot of that's going to happen not the day of the actual invasion, but as they try to gain control of the island because of this extensive network. This kind of shows you a picture of Mount Suribachi. You can see, first off, its proximity to Japan. This is a picture of the volcano, and this is where the airstrip was, right here. And so they're trying to get control of that. It's really difficult fighting. This is the iconic picture from Iwo Jima, if you're familiar with the movie Flags of Our Fathers. But you've also got, you know, this is what is that symbolizes the Marines, is this raising of the flag. And of course, part of the story of raising the flag is that they take one picture and then they said, oh, we need a bigger flag, and so they do another picture. So the picture that's the iconic picture is actually the second picture that was taken, not the first one. There's kind of a whole backstory to that that's not necessarily important for you guys in U.S. history. But I have a clip down here making of a memorial and several pictures from Iwo Jima. Again, it's very challenging fighting. If you ever hear of anybody who had fought in Iwo Jima, if you have any, you know, older relatives or whatever, just understand how horrible the fighting was. Once they have control of Iwo Jima, they start firebombing Tokyo. This is dropping jellied gasoline. That happens from March through June of 45. And of course, one of the issues that's going to happen is that, you know, one of the things about the atomic bomb is that people say, well, we're already firebombing Japan and we've got all these civilians being killed and it's causing these uncontrolled fires. And, you know, so really what difference does an atomic bomb make? So just kind of keep in mind that we're really targeting Tokyo, we're really targeting Japan. You've got lots of civilians being sacrificed, and still the military won't give up. You have continued use of kamikaze attacks, which you can see here. And so this kind of shows you some of the bombing campaigns. Okinawa is it's a part of actual Japan, but it's a little bit of an island off the tip of mainland. And again, you have all these, you know, positions in the mountains. You have these dug-in Japanese. It's very difficult to actually get control of the island. You have 12,000 Americans dying. So you've got this increasing number of American dead the closer we get to Japan. So by June, we actually have Okinawa captured, and you can see the clip. This shows you kind of them moving through this area. You know, lots of really, you know, kind of moving pictures from that. So the big issue for Japanese surrender, first off, the military doesn't want to surrender. The military wants to maintain control. The Japanese emperor, after Okinawa falls, as the firebombing is increasing, the emperor is starting to really feel for the people, and he says, maybe we should surrender, but the military won't sign off. And so you have that issue, and one of the issues is that the emperor doesn't want to step down. And you've got Americans that are like, well, maybe we should make the emperor step down because he was in charge, and but understand that in the Japanese model, the emperor and the military kind of shared responsibility. And so you've kind of got this period in June and July where it's, how are we going to have them surrender? Are they going to surrender? That kind of thing. And it's into this that you have the decision to drop the atomic bomb. Now, the atomic bomb was created, it starts way back in like 1939, right, 1938, when Eisenhower writes his letter to FDR and says, I'm worried that the Germans are going to get control of this new bomb and this new weapon, and it's going to, allow them to take over the world. And so Eisenhower will create the Manhattan Project, which you can see the link here. And this is an entire project that goes from taking this idea of fission and dividing atoms all the way to actual construction of a bomb. And they create entire communities based around this, all that kind of stuff. And I've got some of the names there that you can see. What will happen is that in July of 1945, we have the first successful detonation. And when that happens, and of course, Truman finds out about the Manhattan Project after he becomes president. But by the time he finds out, right, they're just a couple months from actually having a bomb to detonate. And so the big question was whether or not to use the atomic bomb. Is this, is it moral? Is it right for people to do that? Should, we understand that it's going to kill a lot of civilians. Is it okay? Except that you have Truman trying to decide over this question of whether or not, whether or not it's worth, not using the atomic bomb against Japanese civilians is worth the death of all the Americans that they expect. And they expected like 200,000 casualties. So I've got a video link here about the atomic bomb debate. And so you've got this whole debate that goes on. And you do have kind of a vague warning that goes out at the beginning of August that says, hey, if you don't surrender, you're going to have prompt and utter destruction. To which the Japanese military says, okay, no, right? I mean, they're dug in. They're determined to make American soldiers suffer if they're going to try to take over Japan. So August 6, 1945, the Enola Gay drops the bomb Little Boy on Hiroshima. And you can see the statistics right there. And then 3 days later, they drop Fat Man, which is the name of the other bomb, on Nagasaki. And this prompts the immediate surrender of Japan. And here's some pictures from some of the destruction. Massive casualties from this. And so you've got, of course, the Soviet Union in this whole process. They decided to declare war on Japan on August 9th. Now, part of the backstory here is that the U.S. has, they discovered that the U.S. has an atomic bomb, and oh hey, we want to be friends with these people. Plus, they're trying to make a territory grab. So finally, by August, the Soviets are starting to, talk about invading Japan. But a lot of this has to do with them trying to position themselves for that global influence, which is actually going to be this whole idea that sets us up for the Cold War. So be sure you kind of understand that, and you can see the video link there. VJ Day, Victory in Japan Day. That iconic picture of the unknown sailor kissing the unknown nurse. And you have really an unconditional surrender, although the Japanese emperor is allowed to maintain his title. He does stay as emperor. And there can be some debate held about whether or not that was truly appropriate. You have in July, before we drop the atomic bomb, the Potsdam Conference. And one of the things that will happen with the Potsdam Conference is that, Truman will basically call Stalin out and say, hey, dude, you haven't, declared war on Japan. You're supposed to do that according to the previous agreement. Hey, you better step up. And Stalin, and then they have this conversation about what they're going to do about Germany. And remember, in the Tehran conference, FDR and Stalin and Churchill had talked about how they didn't want Germany to be unified after the war. Well, you have that actually decided on during the Potsdam Conference that happens in July of 45. So that conference is going to actually partition Germany into 4 different parts. Each part controlled by one of the allies, and we'll get to that a little bit more here in a second. You have the United Nations. Sometimes there's questions about this on the STAR test, so I want to mention it. Keep in mind that this starts in 1944, so this is starting, and I mentioned that the Tehran Conference lays the foundation for this. These countries meet in the United States. They form the United Nations. You have a General Assembly where all member countries have one vote. They vote on resolutions, they vote on the budget, and they also choose the rotating number of non-permanent Security Council. Security Council has 11 members. 5 of them are permanent, and you can see the list right there. Notice these are all allies, and each of these can veto military action. That will be important when we get to talking about the Korean conflict and how that develops. And then you've got rotating members from all the other member countries. And the main idea is to maintain peace and security, maintain an atmosphere of cooperation. Now, the United Nations, led in part by the United States, will focus on putting the Axis on trial, whether it's the Germans and the Holocaust, or whether it's the Japanese and the POW camps. And so you have an international military tribunal in Nuremberg, Germany, and then you'll have one later for the Far East. And you can see the results there. About people that were executed and held accountable for that. And the Japanese understand that we barely even begin to hold the Japanese accountable for what all that they had done. We don't even really mention what happened in China. And the comfort women issue, that's when they would take these women, whether it was Korea or French Indochina, which is now Vietnam, or the Chinese, and they would basically force these women to be prostitutes for the soldiers, except they weren't getting paid, right? There was no choice. And they would abuse these women, and trying to hold them accountable for that is very tricky. Now, part of what will happen by August and summer of 45, especially with the Far East Tribunal, as that begins to happen in later 45 and 46, is it becomes very difficult as the Cold War is beginning to emerge, and we have this tension with the Soviet Union. Having control of Japan and having them as kind of a friendly place for us to operate to check Soviet power becomes very important. So one of the reasons why we don't hold the Japanese completely accountable is because of that. But at the end of the day, you have the United States and the United Nations trying to hold them accountable for what happened. And these are pictures from the Nuremberg trials. And again, I'm just barely touching on that because there's actually a whole lot of interesting kind of side notes about Goring and how he was tried and all that kind of stuff. So World War II lays the foundation for the world as we know it today. It establishes the pattern for the Middle East, in that we try to kind of give some of these Middle Eastern countries some independence. We have the emerging tensions with the United States and the Soviet Union that becomes the Cold War. This leads to things like the Iron Curtain, where basically you have the Soviet Union kind of takes over certain countries, and they refuse to allow free elections. You're going to have NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, that's formed by democratic countries, meant to counterbalance the rise of communism in Eastern Europe. The Warsaw Pact, where the Eastern European communist countries get together, and we have this emerging pattern of Asian conflicts, whether it's Korea and then later Vietnam. And we'll get into that in more detail in Unit 8. All of this creates the foundation for the Cold War. So as we're talking about 1945, it's setting us up for the Cold War and what's happening. You also see the United States becoming this world leader. Protecting democracy. Democracy is an ideology in everything that it means, whether it's Christianity, whether it's capitalism, whether it's, independence, whatever it means. You have the United States really emerging as taking a lead in the world and trying to spread democracy. The U.S. temporarily has atomic supremacy, but that will be over by like 1948. when the Soviets test their first atomic bomb. And this will lead to one of the major aspects of the Cold War, which is atomic weapon buildup. And then, of course, the prevailing question from World War II is how effective is the United Nations? Is it good for the United States to be held accountable by the United Nations? Is the United Nations effective for promoting peace? How does all of that work? And so there's lots of questions about the role of the Security Council and all of this. And these are all things that we'll be talking about as we move into Unit 8. This kind of gives you an idea of the picture of the Soviet bloc. You've got over here the Soviet Union, and these are the countries that they influence. These are the ones, this is what we call the Iron Curtain that kind of divides this part of Europe. So Poland, this Eastern Germany, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, those places are all become a part of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. So they're under the influence. And if you remember back to the beginning of this unit when I talked about how communism works, that's what it's intended to do. You can see over here is a picture of Germany and how they divide Germany up. You've got basically Berlin in the middle of the Soviet zone. You've got the American zone, the French zone, the British zone. So they have these 4 zones divided up among the Allies. Now what will happen is as the Cold War tensions in the Soviet Union gets worse, right? So Potsdam creates this, right, these 4 zones. As the tensions get worse, as the Soviet Union gets mad because they don't like that they feel like we lied about the atomic bomb, and they feel, all that kind of stuff. What you'll see is that that this tension really affects sorry, I'm trying to do something else at the moment. So you see that this tension will kind of affect these relations. And so the Soviet bloc of Eastern Germany will actually eventually become very isolated. This is where you have the Berlin airlift, and you can see this where the Allies will bring supplies in because they'll blockade the city of Berlin. And so Berlin itself will be divided into a western half that is democratic and an eastern half that is communist. And so really this picture of Europe really defines what the Cold War will be about. So this is why it's important that you remember the Potsdam Conference, because it creates this tension right here in Germany. And then, of course, this issue with Berlin. And when we get to the Cold War, one of the first things we'll talk about is the Berlin airlift and the construction of the Berlin Wall and how all of that came about. You can see here in Asia, there's Japan. Of course, the U.S. will maintain an influence in Japan for some time, even still today. You can see the proximity to Russia, which is part of why, or the Soviet Union, which is part of why we could probably kind of soft-sold some of the military tribunal and holding the Japanese accountable. You can see the division of North Korea and South Korea. What will happen is after the Soviets declare war on Japan, they'll use that as a justification to sweep in to this part of Korea. And the Americans will sweep into that part of Korea. And this is why we have this permanently divided Korea, is because neither side really leaves. And the U.S. creates this democratic South Korea, and the Soviet Union puts the Kim family in charge. And so this is why we have Kim Jong-un, who is the dictator of North Korea. China has a whole nother story as the Cold War. China is going to be... will become communist as well, and there's more to that having to do with the failure of the Nationalist Party that will eventually go to Taiwan, and they haven't done a very good job of taking care of the Chinese people. They weren't very effective fighting the Japanese, and so the Chinese will then embrace communism. And communism in China has kind of a challenging history. You go through a period where it's incredibly harsh and there's a lot of difficult measures, all the way up into now where you have kind of this weird hybrid where technically it's still communist. There's only one party in charge of China, but economically they're starting to develop aspects that are very similar to capitalism. So China's kind of different. This is where Vietnam will be. So when we talk about the Korean War, we're talking about this area. When we're talking about Vietnam, this is the area that we're going to be talking about off the southern tip of China. And it's going to be similar to Korea, and that you have communists trying to put pressure up here and, us trying to maintain democracy. But Vietnam's something for the next unit. So this kind of gets us to the end of the war and some of the key concepts. Again, just remember that you have the big battles you have the Battle of the Bulge, you've got VE Day, you're going to have Iwo Jima and Okinawa, and then the atomic bomb debate, and then you're going to have VJ Day. The last thing I'm going to leave you with, you have the Yalta Conference. That was the last conference that Roosevelt was at with Stalin and Churchill, and you can see here how sick he was. This takes place in like February of 45, and at this conference, he knows about the Manhattan Project, and he doesn't tell Stalin, and this is part of why Stalin will get so angry. And of course, then Truman doesn't work nearly as well with Stalin as FDR does. And of course, the atomic bomb will change everything. And this is the same map that I showed you of Europe after World War II. Here's another map of the impact of the Potsdam Conference, where they divided Germany into different areas and different zones of influence. This shows you another map of the Iron Curtain. This is what Churchill means when he says it's as though an Iron Curtain has descended across Europe. And so you have this entire area that's under the influence of the Soviet Union. So when we're talking about policies today with the Soviet Union and we're talking about the Ukraine, you're talking about this area. These countries right here are the ones that continue to struggle. Germany's still right here. Of course, Germany's now unified. It's not separated anymore. And I showed you this map again. So we'll kind of review this when we come back to the Cold War. So this is it for World War II. You guys have the terms and events. Those are tied directly to my lecture PowerPoints. You should be able to get all the terms. Pick 10 events. Create an illustrated timeline. Picture the description that you've identified, put it in chronological order. You can do this in Google Slides, one event per slide, or you can cut out pictures and put it on a piece of paper. It can be as simple or as complicated as you want it to be. The test is Tuesday. If you are missing your internment camp letter to the editor, get that turned in. If you're missing any other assignments, get that turned in. Honors class, you have an essay over the atomic bomb debate that's due on Tuesday as well. If you have any questions, please email me. So those of you in first and fifth period, you will have Friday, the rest of class today, which isn't much time, but you'll have Friday to work on your illustrated timeline and study for the test. Those of you in my 2B and 3B classes, you have the rest of class to work on your illustrated timeline, to get that taken care of. Look at those key terms. Please get that done. There's no reason for this to be homework. You should be able to complete it in class. And then if you're in 2B, you can study for the test if you have that done. And if you're in my 3B honors class, you can use that time to work on your essay. Like I said, if you have any questions, let me know. Otherwise, study first and fifth period. I will see you on Monday to answer any questions you might have, and have a good weekend.